Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Threadbare Reviews. Today, I'll be following patron Aaron Dunn's request and reviewing an unusual fantasy book called The Black Company. Its author is a man named Glenn Cook, and he first published today's subject in 1984. About the author. Glenn Cook was born in 1944 in New York City. I didn't find too much about his early years or childhood, but something I did find is that he volunteered for the United States Navy in 1962 and served in a Marine battalion. This was back before the Navy and Marines were separate branches. He did not, however, end up going to Vietnam. Instead, he left active duty about a month before his unit shipped out. But he did spend a lot of time around soldiers, and that shows in his writing. After the military, Cook would go on to get an unspecified degree at the University of Missouri, and after college, he worked on the assembly line at a General Motors factory. He stuck with that job for 33 years, and since it didn't require much mental effort, he spent a lot of his free time writing novels. Cook had had a lot of interest in writing speculative fiction, even when he was growing up, but according to him, the moment he decided to write professionally came when he was reading a fantasy novel during a lunch break. He got frustrated by how terrible it was, and he decided he could do better himself. During his peak, Cook was writing 2 novels per year, while still working full-time at GM. The Black Company was not Cook's first novel, but it did kick off what is, for most people, his best-known series. He wrote and published the first trilogy in 1984 and 85, and then years later he returned to the setting in 1989, and again in the latter half of the 90s. At the moment, there are 11 books in the series, with one more supposedly on its way that will conclude the series, but which hasn't been heard from in years. Anyway, no point in going on about a whole fantasy series when we're just here to talk about the first book, so let's get to it. The review. The titular Black Company is an elite mercenary group, the last of the free companies of Katovar, and they have centuries of company history recorded in their annals. This history helps keep the company together and forge bonds of brotherhood. But aside from that, the members are just as morally dubious and happy to rape and pillage as any other band of medieval mercenaries. As the book starts, they're contracted to protect the leader or syndic of a city-state called Beryl. But as the city descends into chaos and rioting, the company concludes their contract and signs on with a visitor from the Northern Empire. The Northern Empire turns out to be your basic evil fantasy empire, and their employer is one of its chief lieutenants, Soulcatcher. The rest of the book has a very episodic format, based around the different engagements the Black Company gets sent to, as it tries to sabotage the Rebel Alliance and defend the Empire against their advances. And although the mercenaries keep scoring victories, the tide of the war pushes back against the Empire until they have to defend their capital against an army 250,000 strong. Their defense is not helped by the constant infighting between the Empire's lieutenants, called the Taken, some of whom want to see their mistress, the Lady, continue to stay in charge, and some of whom want to bring back her sealed husband, the Dominator. The Black Company ends up in the middle of all of these conflicts, particularly the company's doctor and archivist, and the book's narrator, whom we only know of as Croker. In the end, the Empire does carry the day, but at an immense cost to both sides, and with foreshadowing to a more successful rebel effort in the future. The Black Company has a very unusual style for a fantasy novel. I wouldn't call it unique, because there are other gritty speculative fiction works out there, such as Gaunt's Ghosts, but then Gaunt's Ghosts came out 15 years after this book. The way the novel focuses on little details and personal encounters instead of on sweeping narratives of massive battles really reminds me of soldier memoirs I've read. But at the same time, the book also indulges in regular fantasy tropes, like having an unassuming protagonist whose actions change the shape of the war around him. But hey, there's a reason they call the genre fantasy. Something else I noticed about the book is that it's very specific about how the mercenaries are from the south, from a land beyond the sea where the winters don't get cold enough for snow and where elephants are a regular sight on battlefields. In other words, they sound an awful lot like the Haradrim, the dark-skinned southerners who fight for Sauron during The Lord of the Rings. Now, the details are all different, of course, but I could definitely see this book as being the result of Glenn Cook asking himself, what would The Lord of the Rings be like if it were written from the Haradrim's perspective? Now, another thing you probably expected from a book like this is that the war isn't really between good and evil. It's between the evil that is currently in charge and the evil that used to be in charge and wants their power back. The rebels appear to have the moral high ground at first blush, but both sides use human lives as pawns. Both sides have no intention to share their power with the people who fight and die for them, and both sides are happy to pillage and rape the towns they seize from the enemy. The Black Company itself is no better. While the mercenaries have a sense of honor when it comes to fulfilling the letter of their contracts, they're fine with pretty much anything else. Now, there are certain lines they won't cross, and they never even consider betraying each other, but they are by no means good people. Nobody becomes a mercenary because they want to make the world a better place. As for criticism, there was one thing that bugged me as I read the book, and it's the fact that the Black Company never gets bad intelligence. They regularly stumble into enemy correspondence, and not once is it planted or out of date or even ciphered. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, but it never did, and it made the company's success feel unrealistic at times. But, all in all, I strongly recommend reading this book. It's a gritty, dark fantasy that describes the horrors of war without glorifying them, and it humanizes both the low-class soldiers and the high-class nobles and officers in a way you especially didn't see back in the 1980s. The analysis. Knowing that Glenn Cook was active military during the Vietnam War era, I can't help but see parallels between that conflict and the one in the Black Company. The protagonists are elite soldiers fighting in a foreign land, and even though they keep winning battles, the war always seems to turn against them. They're fighting against evil people, but in the name of an evil cause, and yet, as soldiers, all they can really do is go where their leaders tell them to go, and fight the battles they're told to fight. The sense you get from this novel, along with real-life combat memoirs, is that a soldier's life isn't really about glorious battles or noble defenses or tense battlefield duels. It's about long marches through blizzards and sandstorms, about how much money you can win in the next card game, and about the prank wars that go on between some of the crazier members of the unit. Occasionally, it's also about sabotage missions, the chaos of a battlefield, and pillaging towns. But as far as memories go, it's the everyday events that keep piling up. Something else the book does is place a big emphasis on nicknames. Everyone in the Black Company is known only by a nickname. The captain is just the captain. The lieutenant is just the lieutenant. The 4 company mages are Goblin, Silent, One-Eye, and Tom-Tom, and the protagonist is Croaker. The people in charge of the evil empire are also only known by nicknames, and even the Council of 18 that leads the rebellion go by aliases. The mercenaries use nicknames as a way to shed their old lives and be reborn into the company brotherhood, but with the mages, it's a bit more serious. If someone knows a wizard's true name, that person can penetrate all their magical defenses and render them harmless or kill them. And while there are other magic systems and fantasy worlds where that's also true, in this case, I can't help but see another parallel between the book and real-world soldiers. Soldiers also use a lot of nicknames, and I sometimes think it might be a way of creating a war persona, of creating a distance between who you are when you're at war and who you are when you're at home. And I realize that nicknames are assigned by other people, but if everyone gets a nickname and everyone expects to get a nickname, it still amounts to the same thing. You are one person when you're at war and a different person when you're at home. And if someone were to find out who that home person was, they could do a whole lot of damage if they happen to be an enemy. Thanks for joining me again for today's Threadbare review, and I hope I'll see you next time. Until then, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and if you have a little extra money to spare, you can support me on Patreon. Link in the description.